Morning. I'm Leila Abed, Director of the Wilson Center's Mexico Institute, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar. On February 1st, President Donald Trump announced the imposition of tariffs on its top trading partners, a 25% tariff on all Mexican and Canadian imports, and a 10% tariff on China. According to a White House press release, the Trump administration lays out the justification for imposing the tariffs. Essentially, that illegal migration and drug trafficking, predominantly fentanyl, constitute a national emergency under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. In essence, trade is now inherently linked to migration and security efforts. But approximately 12 hours before the tariffs were expected to come into effect, President Trump held separate calls with President Claudia Sheinbaum and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and struck deals with its two North American partners to pause the tariffs for the next 30 days. Mexico promised to deploy 10,000 of its National Guard members to the U.S.-Mexico border to crack down on illegal immigration and to stop the flow of fentanyl into the United States. In addition, both governments agreed to establish high-level negotiations on trade and security, and the U.S. promised to prevent the trafficking of weapons to Mexico. Prime Minister Trudeau announced Canada was implementing a $1.3 billion border plan that included nearly 10,000 frontline workers and more resources to halt the flow of fentanyl, and also included the appointment of a fentanyl czar. Canada also announced the launch of a joint strike force with the U.S. to combat crime and money laundering. In contrast, Beijing announced it was imposing retaliatory tariffs on a variety of American products, including 15% on coal and liquefied natural gas and 10% on crude oil and agricultural machinery. To discuss these developments and to analyze what we can expect to unfold in the next month and how China may respond or benefit from the situation, the Wilson Center's Mexico, Canada, Kissinger, and WABA Institutes convened subject matter experts for today's discussion. We are truly grateful to all of our panelists for joining us this morning. A quick reminder before we begin, we will have a Q&A session towards the end of the discussion. If you would like to submit questions to our panelists, please do so via the Zoom chat box. And with that, I turn it over to our wonderful moderator, Ambassador Tony Wayne, who will also introduce our speakers. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Leila. It's a great pleasure to be here and to be here with such a fine crew. We're going to hear from Keith Crane, who will be talking broadly about the economic patterns of interaction between the three countries. Alberto Garcia Vasquez, the chief economist of Data Wheel, which is in the United States, but previously he has long experience working in Mexico. Chris Sands, who is our head of our Canada Institute, who's going to talk about the Canadian perspective of things, and Jim Mullinex, who I had the pleasure of working with a number of years ago, and it's great to have him back. He's currently working with the China folk at the Wilson Center and still, of course, a State Department stalwart. And so we're going to explore the perspective from each of these countries. And I might suggest that everybody just start off by giving us 5 minutes or so of their perspective of where things are. Maybe we could start with Keith, if you want to give an overall picture.
Sure. Thank you. And thank you for inviting me to speak today. I think the results we've seen, a postponement of 30 days in terms of imposition of tariffs on Canada and Mexico, and the continued and the imposition of 10 percentage points additional tariffs in the case of China really reflect the very differences in the type of trade we're looking at here. I think there may have been a model that putting tariffs on Mexico and Canada is somewhat like having a shirt just made in the United States, and they have a shirt made in Mexico, and so suddenly the Mexican shirt goes up 25%, and that would help American manufacturers. This isn't the case at all. The integration of Canada and Mexico in terms of our economies is such that almost everything manufactured in the United States, especially automobiles and appliances, really involve supply chains that go back and forth across the border. So if we put a 25% tariff on Canadian or Mexican goods, you could raise the price of automobiles in the United States by close to $6,000–7,000. There is no shirt equivalent here. Every car made in the United States or in Mexico has components from both. So the economic implications of this is that putting a tariff on Canada and Mexico really is equivalent to putting it really taxing American manufacturers. And from a political perspective, to have the U.S. car industry, kind of shut down for 2 or 3 months as consumers say, I'm not going to pay an extra $6,000 for this car, I'm going to wait, has big political implications for the United States as well. The other issue that we have has to do kind of with China. In the case of China, it's quite different because the supply chains kind of go one way. Much of the manufacturers in China will maybe source from East Asia or whatever. They may even include chips from the United States, but we don't have this back and forth that we see with Mexico. So as a consequence, putting a 10 percentage point increase in tariffs on a country where we already have had high tariffs since the previous Trump administration has an impact in terms of kind of more of a decoupling. We've actually seen quite a bit of shift in supply chains since the 2018-2017 tariffs from China in 2023, 2024. Imports were down 20%, which in my mind showed it took 4 or 5 years for supply chains to adjust, and these probably won't go back. Do I think that the administration will impose tariffs 30 days from now on Canada or Mexico? I'm pretty doubtful. I think the political implications are that both in Canada and in Mexico, you've seen a lot of support for kind of pushing back against American ultimatums. In the United States, the consequences would be not only increases in prices for automobiles. If you put a 10% tariff on Canadian oil, Canada provides close to 60% of our imports for our refineries. You could see 20, 30%, 30-cent increase in terms of gasoline prices. If you're looking at food, which has been a very sensitive political issue in the United States, we would again see some very substantial increases because we rely on Mexico so much for vegetables and fruits. So I'm kind of skeptical that U.S. leverage using this threat would not backfire in the United States. So with that, I'll kind of turn it over to our next speaker.
Okay, thank you, Keith. That's a very good view of things. Gilberto, do you want to add a little bit looking from the South at this complex situation?
Yeah, and thank you so much, and thanks for the invitation. And not only for the South, I think that this perspective of seeing North America as an integrated system is the right approach to this conversation. And North America, Mexico, the US, and Canada are not trade partners in the traditional way, right? Like trade in the region is not just about exports and imports. North America functions as a deeply integrated production hub. The US, Mexico and Canada, don't just sell to each other, right? They co-produce everything from cars to semiconductors to CPUs, for example. Now, with a 25% tariff on Mexico and Canada, this system faces a major disruption. The problem is that when you impose tariffs on your production partners, you impose tariffs on yourselves. So, for example, nearly 40% of US imports from Mexico are intermediate goods, auto parts, electronics, and machinery that the US industry relies on. The auto industry, I totally agree, it's a great example of this and is highly exposed, right? Car assembled in North America cross the border 7-8 times before it reaches a dealership. So a 25% tariff increases cost at every single step. And the same applies to medical devices, industrial equipment, food supply chains. This isn't just a tax on foreign goods, it's a tax on the entire North American production system, and that needs to be clearly understood. So rather than boosting US industry, these tariffs raise costs for US businesses, consumers, and threaten the North America competitiveness and create supply chain uncertainty. And that's another point that I would like to make in terms of supply chain disruptions and how Mexico may respond to this. It is important to understand that trade is a complex system. It's interconnected, dynamic, and also unpredictable. When policymakers impose sweeping tariffs, they are assuming that they can control the outcome. But in a complex system, disruptions don't lead to simple linear effects. They trigger feedback loops, unintended consequences, and there's a strategic adjustment from the trading partners that often undermine the original intent on this. For example, Mexico is not just going to sit back and absorb the effect of the tariffs. Mexico has options. Every country has options. And in this case, Mexico has at least two options. One is retaliation, and the other one is adaptation. In terms of retaliation, Mexico has done it before. We saw it on the previous Trump administration when Mexico started targeting politically sensitive US exports like pork, apples, cheese. So it can do it again. In terms of adaptation, and that's the real shift that will come, that could come from this disruption and supply chain diversification. If US inputs become too expensive for Mexico's producers, Mexico consumers, Mexico will turn to Asia and Europe, not only for new suppliers, but also for new markets. And there's a bigger transformation that could happen. Mexico completing its own supply chains. So instead of just assembling cars, electronics, and medical devices, Mexico could start producing more of its own components and reducing reliance on the US. So this could accelerate Mexico's transformation from dependent on trade with the US to a more self-sufficient production hub with new alliances and alignment in terms of trade. So this means that over time, Mexico not just adapt to the tariffs and the uncertainty around North American project, it could use them as a catalyst for deeper economic independence and transformation. And that makes for my third point on this initial remarks, and that's that China is a strategic player on this, and it could take advantage of these disruptions. Every single time the US disrupts trade, China finds an opening. It has happened before, and it will happen again. Mexico is already China's largest trade partner in Latin America. If tariffs raise and the cost of US inputs, for example, again, Mexican manufacturers could shift even more sourcing to Chinese suppliers. China could also use raising prices in the US and in the less competitiveness of the US industry to expand its exports to third markets, undercutting US exports globally. And then instead of direct retaliation, China might respond with a strategic innovation. For example, the US ban on exports of advanced chips led to the emergence of DeepSeek, right? Which operates without relying on those sophisticated chips. So the intention was to slow down China's artificial intelligence development, but instead it pushed China to innovate in a different direction. So we need to understand that countries adapt, and sometimes in ways that policymakers do not anticipate. And similarly, these tariffs won't necessarily bring production back to the US. They might just accelerate supply chain realignment in North America and specifically in Mexico. So we need to understand that there are unintended consequences of trade disruptions. Tariffs are often framed as a tool of economic coercion, but in complex systems like trade, disruptions don't just produce simple results. For example, in this case, the US wanted more control over North American trade, but these tariffs may weaken North American competitiveness instead. The US wanted to pressure Mexico, but this could accelerate Mexico's move towards supply chain independence and economic diversification. The US wanted to contain China, but this could push China to expand its trade influence even further. In global trade, adaptation is not an exception, it's the rule. The real question now isn't whether these tariffs, if they happen, will create change. They will. But what kind of change, and whether the US will be prepared for the consequences of this disruption?
Thank you, Gilberto. It's quite clear that we're going to have to be watching all the angles of these trading relationships and watching shifts and how people adapt to them. And it's going to be moving in all directions. So I think that's right. So Chris, do you want to add a little bit from a Canadian perspective at looking at this, and then we'll go to Jim following up to talk about China. You're on.
Sorry about that. Thanks very much, Master Wayne. I think it's a really important point, the interconnectedness of things. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the current government. Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister, came into office in 2015 with the idea of developing a relationship with China, both economic and political, as a counterweight to its relationship with the US, which is quite close. That that venture, which was supported by a lot of Canadians, ran aground because of the case of Meng Wanzhou, the Huawei CFO, who was arrested on a U.S. extradition warrant in Vancouver, who became, her extradition hearings went on for several years, and she was eventually returned to China after the start of the Biden administration. That incident, which was followed by China taking a couple of Canadian citizens as hostages, really soured the Canadian public attitude about China. Even though there are significant numbers of Chinese Canadians, there was a lot of suspicion of China. We subsequently found that China had engaged in foreign election interference, threatening Canadian politicians of Chinese heritage, that they would either be undermined or their families would be at risk. The anti-Chinese mood is very strong, and that kind of inoculates Canada against Chinese influence. However, one of the other things that we've seen in the last couple of days is a surge in Canadian nationalism in response to the 25% tariff threat. And as angry as Canadians are about China, they're also increasingly angry about the United States. And that's going to be very challenging for Canada. Justin Trudeau resigned on January 6, 2025. There's a process underway to select his replacement as leader of the Liberal Party, who will become the next prime minister. And then we expect an election later in the year, probably in the spring, but no later than October 2025. If you'd asked me last year, I would have said, well, it was all very predictable. Liberals have been around a while. They'll switch over to the Conservatives. But what's happened is that the Canadian public is so angry in both directions. The next prime minister is going to have very limited room to maneuver, particularly if the 25% tariffs are actually applied rather than just threatened. There'll always be a little bit of lingering suspicion. But I think the anger at the United States is sufficient to maybe create an interest in some companies looking at what they could do with China. And there are a couple of examples in it. A bit like Gilberto, I want to talk about it by sector. A lot of Canada's exports are commodities, primary products, whether it's agriculture or energy, or critical minerals, iron ore, you name it, all of that produced there. Those goods are highly susceptible to a 25% tariff because they're in a commodity market. It's the availability of the good on the market that determines price. And so if you jack up the price from one country, it's going to be unsaleable. They've looked at maybe putting export tax for certain countries on those raw materials. So perhaps a 10 or 25% export tax against the US so that the US pays the higher prices, leaving them free to sell those goods in other markets. And remember that China and a lot of Asia is very hungry for energy and raw materials. So Canada would look, I think, seriously at that if it was under a 25% tariff in the US. The second sector I'd highlight is intermediate goods. It's a funny thing in trade, but Canada is so integrated in our supply chains. They make a lot of things that are not the final product and are not the raw material. I don't know what to call them, maybe widgets, but whatever those little things are, they may be automotive components, they might be a piece of a toaster or a refrigerator, but because they are integrated in supply chains with intermediate goods being their specialty, there are a lot of businesses that will really have to struggle with the 25% tariff. They may not have a US firm that can step in and make what they make. That might lead them to look to invest in the United States or license their products so that they could do some production in the US. But they'll also be looking at sophisticated supply chains into which they could enter, including European supply chains, I think, as the first and foremost, and some Asia Pacific supply chains as well, because they make things in the middle. They can't just sell the middle, except I guess as spare parts. So we're in a very uncertain period. I think we can get past it, but we've created the conditions for Canada to look at China when Canada was completely aligned with the US against China just a few months ago. I think if we can avoid the 25% tariff, we will be able to get past that. However, we've changed the politics in Canada. We've spurred nationalism, and it's going to be a little more difficult to work with Canada than it would have been just a few weeks ago.
Thank you very much, Chris. And I think it's important to note that with the two neighbors of the United States, we do have people that are currently producing as part of an integrated supply chain in a number of these goods, in cars and other things. And then we have key components that each country has been supplying unilaterally that go into our supply chain, some of which go into other things, some of the minerals, some of the food products, the agriculture products just go right into our what we eat, what we use right away. And so it's a very complex situation. Now, Jim, why don't you add a little bit about if we throw China in here, what happens?
Great. Well, thank you so much, Ambassador Wayne. And as you noted, we have had a chance to work together previously at the State Department. And I am currently, in addition to being a diplomatic fellow at the Wilson Center, still a senior foreign service officer at the State Department. So I need to start with a caveat, which is that my comments today reflect my own personal views. They do not necessarily reflect the views of the administration or of the Department of State. So having started with that, let me say, in contrast to our Mexican and Canadian trading partners, China rather, is, I think, probably not terribly surprised about the threat of tariffs and the actual imposition of tariffs. And you can see that by their immediate response, which, literally minutes after President Trump made his announcement, the Chinese announced their own sort of retaliatory measures. Leila mentioned some of them at the beginning, tariffs on certain types of energy exports from the United States, tariffs as well on farm equipment and large displacement automobiles, but also an expansion of export controls on several critical minerals, including tungsten, indium, bismuth, that are crucial to U.S. manufacturing in some specific areas. As well, the Chinese Ministry of Commerce also added 2 American companies to their unreliable entities list, PVH, which is a textile company, and Illumina, a biotech company. This is really unprecedented in the sense that while other U.S. companies have been added to the unreliable entity list, this is the first time that we have non-defense companies added to this UEL list. And these companies, in the past, when China has added U.S. companies to their unreliable entity list, it's been in direct response to weapons sales to Taiwan. Excuse me. These 2 companies have nothing to do with weapons sales to Taiwan. Obviously, the PVH textile company is involved in the manufacturing of clothing and other branded textiles, and then Illumina is involved in biotech manufacturing, and so no defense-related connection at all. In addition, the Chinese announced an investigation into Google for antitrust violations, and of course, they also filed a WTO case. So they're very, very clearly well prepared to respond. However, the scope of their response, while it is relatively significant, it's not overly broad, and the impact on U.S. trade is really, estimates range to about $20 billion worth of trade. So it's not a terribly punitive response on the part of the Chinese. It could have been much more significant, especially considering the 10% tariff on over $450 billion worth of Chinese exports that President Trump has added to the already existing tariffs on many goods. So the Chinese response, I think, is significant. It's expected, but it leaves room for additional discussions. And of course, there was some rumors going around that there would be a Trump-Xi phone call. That has not yet landed, but it may land in the future in coming days. It's hard to say. And of course, there's also been some discussion about President Trump and President Xi having a meeting at some point in the very near future as well. There are opportunities for future discussion about whether or not these tariffs could be adjusted, or other types of responses could be forthcoming. So stay tuned on that. But to the point that others have made, the tariffs on goods coming from China to the United States are a little bit different from what you see threatened against Mexico and Canada, because supply chains are different. However, there are still very strong supply chains that rely on Chinese imports in the United States. Some industries may be forced to raise prices. Certainly, there will be an added cost. China, of course, is a major exporter of IT goods, a major exporter of electrical components and machinery, all of which could impact U.S. producers and make U.S. products more expensive, both intermediate products and industrial products, but also products going direct to consumers. One piece that I think is really, really interesting and maybe hasn't been discussed quite as much in the executive order that President Trump signed with respect to the tariffs on China, he also abolished China's exemption for de minimis shipments. So that de minimis shipments, of course, are shipments of goods that are under $800 in value. On any given day, there are about 4 million shipments coming into the United States that come in under the de minimis rule. That means they're not generally inspected, they're not subject to tariffs, and they're just processed right in. And a large percentage of those go directly to consumers. So you see, obviously, direct-to-consumer companies like Shein or Temu taking advantage of that to expand their sales in the United States. But a very large number of not just small and medium enterprises, but also large enterprises rely on de minimis shipments for pieces in their supply chain. Those goods are also crucial to U.S. production. And so, this is going to, certainly have an impact on U.S. Industry, U.S. importers of non-consumer goods as well, as they are now going to have to pay additional duty, first of all, but also the time and the manpower that will be required to process these shipments could create some bottlenecks, and it could slow things down for a number of different producers, and that, of course, will lead to probably higher prices and trade disruptions, all of which will cost U.S. business. So there are some significant impacts. The amount of the tariffs compared to what's been proposed for Canada and for Canada and Mexico is relatively small. And I think most importers of goods from China probably should have been expecting this and hopefully preparing for some of these kinds of things. But the impact, I expect, will be real. And we'll have to see what opportunities there are for additional conversations between President Trump and President Xi and members of the administration on the U.S. side and their Chinese counterparts to see where we can go to address the very real concerns. I mean, I will say these tariffs are not imposed just out of nowhere, and there are some demands that are being made with respect to shipments of fentanyl and those kinds of things. So very real concerns on the U.S. side, but there should be opportunities for discussion, hopefully in the not too distant future.
Thank you, Jim. And of course, the Trump administration has been looking for ways that they can make money off of trade, if you put it that way. And this might be a lesser impactful way of doing it than put it all on some of the big products. We'll just have to see as this talking goes forward. So let's talk a little bit about now, thanks to each of you. Let's talk a little bit about some of the big issues here. Let's switch back a minute to Canada and Mexico. And Keith, you can jump in on all these things, on everything, and then we'll come back and we'll get into China. What do Gilberto and Chris, what do you guys see as the main, from the United States, as the main goals? And I'm assuming that Canada and Mexico are mainly interested in maintaining trade as it's going now. And will we, once we get past this immediate, we're going to face the immediate, either Mexico needs to work on organized crime and on other things, and Canada does too, but not really, but it has to. But then we have behind that the overarching trade relationship and what comes out of that. What do each of you see as that evolution as we move forward? And I'm going to say for everybody, I'm assuming that Mexico and Canada are both promising much more cooperation on the border in dealing with drugs coming in and dealing with migrants and dealing with other things. So we'll sort of test that, but we'll get there, and then we're going to be looking at the bigger trade issues. So Gilberto and Chris, if you could say a little bit about that.
Oh, let me start a little bit on this one. So I think it's a very good question. One of the challenges for Canada is it's hard, it's been difficult for them to understand their role in international drug trafficking. They don't see themselves as having, there's obviously drug problems in Canada, but they don't see themselves as in this world to the extent that they really truly are. And part of this is something the US has seen elsewhere. When we do a better job interdicting illegal drugs, say in the Caribbean, Mexico gets more pressure for a land route. If we do a better job in Mexico, the Caribbean sees a lot of drug traffickers moving drugs and even people through. Canada is just another way into the US. And if there's a perception that it's maybe a little bit less monitored, or maybe be easier for cartels to move drugs there and then from there into the United States, it isn't an accusation that Canada is complicit, but that Canada may be a little bit complacent. And that's an important distinction, but it can be fixed if Canadians realize just what they're up against in that regard. The second thing I would say is that Canada came out with their $1.3 billion pledge to do more in a pre-inauguration Mar-a-Lago dinner with the president. And I think tactically that was also a mistake. There was an offer here, please have this free gift. And I think the president said, thank you very much. And when I'm president, I'm going to want more. And he did. And I think that was something that tactically the Canadians didn't do right, because of the assumption that they weren't really the important target, that it was really Mexico. And if they just made a gesture, it would all go away, which clearly it won't. The third thing I would say is, in terms of where I think the Canadians would like to go, is recognizing that President Trump has said that he would like to start the review of USMCA earlier, possibly as soon as July this year. And there's nothing in the USMCA that says we can't start earlier. I think the Canadians would like to put their discussions on the border and on many of these issues in the context of a USMCA review and renegotiation, simply because it takes the drama out of it. It becomes a normal negotiation. There'll still be a lot of high stakes, but it's much more stable for them to manage in that way than to constantly be fighting over social media and hearing, threats coming in all directions. That's created a certain panic and instability that inevitably affects investment. It affects business decisions. It affects employment. So they would like to move to something a bit more stable if they could get there. And I think they'd be willing to compromise on everything else, including giving up some of that complacency, if that's what it took.
I think so. Gilberto, what do you think?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I think that as Jim was saying, these are real concerns, and they're of real importance for the U.S. and Mexico and Canada. The question here is if you are using the correct policy tool to achieve those goals, right? You are trying to make Mexico more responsive in terms of migration and the traffic of illicit drugs. But when you are imposing these tariffs, there are like two things that you need to consider. The first one is, as Kate was saying before, if it's a credible threat, right? Like if you really believe that is going to happen. And this is such a self-inflicted wound in the US economy that you really have to question if it's going to go through the whole way. And the second part is that, let's say that it happens, right? So you will be creating even worse conditions for immigration and perhaps illegal trade from Mexico to the US, given the economic stress that you were going to impose on Mexico for this. So when you are dealing with issues that are such important and complexity like migration and the traffic of illegal drugs, you need to use the correct policy tools, and trade isn't one of them. It's not that Mexico has a button that it can push and then all of a sudden migration and illegal trade of drugs solves, right? It's a little bit more complicated than that. And in terms of then what happens next on that, like that renegotiation of USMCA, or the evaluation of the USMCA, and then decide what to do with it. Even if these tariffs don't happen, you are from Mexico and from Canada, you start questioning the North American project. You start questioning the integration with North America, and then you should be putting all your effort there, right? So instead of looking into the 2026 renegotiation of it happens before, and being thinking, how can we strengthen our relationship? How can we become a more resilient, integrated region, more competitive abroad? Then you start thinking, what are my options if this experiment of North America comes to an end?
Well, I think that's right. And of course, interestingly, President Trump has talked about having the negotiations for the USMCA outcome begin sooner, and maybe get done in an earlier time frame. I don't know, Keith, do you have any thoughts on this tripartite relationship in North America? And then we can switch over to the China part.
Yeah, kind of three comments here. I think, economics can be a little bit obscure, but there's strong evidence that tariffs are nothing but a tax on exports. And to make this clear, if you're in a global trading situation and you create a product and suddenly the cost of an important component goes up 25%, which we're talking about here, you're much less competitive globally. So as we saw with the 2018 increases in tariffs, we actually saw a decline in manufacturing employment, we saw a decline in exports, and we saw a decline in output because of these tariffs. So I think some of the arguments we've heard don't understand that when you have this very integrated North American production base, when you start taxing or interfering, imposing costs on that, everybody loses. And especially the United States. There's no win here at all. I think one of the things that I am hopeful about is the stock market, or the people who trade in the stock market, and understand this. And I think one of the key factors that kind of led to what I think this 30-day hiatus was the sharp decline in the stock market. I can assure you, if you go back, that will repeat and maybe even become worse if there's a real sense that we're trying to blow up this very successful economic relationship. So I'm hopeful that there'll be a realization that this is not a good policy instrument, that it's counterproductive. And again, I would stress that I think the political consequences are bigger in the United States than they are for Canada or Mexico based on this. There's definitely, we heard that there's a response from the Mexican public and from the Canadian public of not wanting to be pushed around. And as we know, inflation has been a huge factor in political issue in the United States. So, having a self-inflicted wound here, so I think a lot of the factors would push, hopefully, for not bringing this up again, or not going forward with it after the 30 days.
Yeah, Keith, there'll be a lot of American companies and participants in the current value chains that are going to say, well, wait, hold on here a minute. We don't want this to get out of hand. We can make some adjustments. We can adjust, and the United States has a role to play, and make sure. But big adjustments, they're going to want to look at that seriously. So that's an excellent point. So let's shift a minute to China. So China's there are some similar efforts going on, both Keith and Jim, but it's a bit different. They're further away. It's a powerful relationship, but it's a relationship with other strains in it. You do have President Trump thinking he could negotiate something with the leader of China. Where do you see this dynamic going, the China-U.S. relationship in the months ahead?
Well, let me just talk briefly about the key issues that are raised in the executive order first, and then I'll try and maybe touch on some of the other aspects of the relationship. Concerns for the United States about Chinese production of fentanyl and fentanyl precursors go back many, many years, and we have had some very, I think it's fair to say we've had some productive discussions with our Chinese counterparts on the classification of certain types of fentanyl or fentanyl precursors over the years. There has been some cooperation, however limited, with Chinese law enforcement to try to interdict or disrupt the flow of some of these goods to the United States. But as we know, with all kinds of trade measures and sanctions and other types of things, as soon as you put in a barrier, people will try to find ways to go around it. And certainly we're seeing that in the last several years with the creation of some of these trade networks that flow through Mexico, or perhaps now some through British Columbia. There's been some discussion of the possibility that those are developing as well. And the expansion of Chinese organized crime groups around the region, perhaps not always in the production of narcotics, but in other aspects of organized crime, including money laundering and finding ways to get that money, from the sale of these goods to the criminal organization. So there are some real concerns there that we need to address with the Chinese. And to their credit, I think the Chinese have been willing to have conversations at certain times about fentanyl and about these types of law enforcement cooperation. China doesn't want to be known as a source for illicit drugs. And so they're, for many reasons, including their own history, right? And so there are, I think, opportunities to have those conversations with our Chinese counterparts about further restrictions on the trade of fentanyl. Not an easy thing for them to do necessarily, pragmatically. These pharmaceutical producers can be relatively small and hard to control, but there is work to be done in that space. Migration is another issue as well. I mean, we talk about Mexican and Latin American migration, or people coming through Mexico. There are a large number of Chinese people also coming to the United States, sometimes in ways that are outside of the legal system. And certainly those migrants that have come to the United States, particularly those who have been involved in criminal activities, we have long sought to return them to China. That has been a sore point because the Chinese have refused to accept them in many cases. And so that is another area where I think there is definitely additional room for us to have conversations with the Chinese and to press them on their willingness to take back migrants, particularly those accused or convicted of crimes in the United States. And so in future discussions with the Chinese, I would expect that both of those topics would be very much at or near the top of the agenda as we talk about any type of trade measures that the U.S. will take, or other types of issues. Now, certainly, we have a very wide array of concerns with respect to the Chinese, and those are just two, and maybe not even necessarily the most strategic in terms of global security. But for the security of people in the United States and security of our country, they're certainly very important. And I would expect that the Trump administration will want to make that a key part of any discussion that they do have with the Chinese. And
eventually, of course, that discussion will have to involve Canada and Mexico, because they're not going to want to become part of the Chinese way of getting around us. And I would assume we would like to involve them in the discussion to some degree with China to help confirm agreement of what we're going to do to slow these flows down, which are clearly happening in a very substantial way through Mexico, in a less substantial but still evident way through Canada, so that the U.S. is still flagging it, even though it seems to be a lesser problem than it is with Mexico. So
Yeah, my understanding is that the Mexican authorities have also had conversations with their Chinese counterparts about ways to disrupt the flow of fentanyl precursors to Mexico. And certainly, I would expect that I would think that any conversation that we would have with the Mexican authorities would encourage them to continue those conversations with the Chinese. Whether we do some sort of a tripartite or quadrilateral discussion, I don't know about that,
yeah.
but certainly bilateral discussions with the PRC about the flow of fentanyl precursors and criminal gang activities is something I think is really important for everybody in the North American region.
And we're having bilateral discussions with Mexico and Canada
Mm-hmm.
on ways to slow that down too. So there's
That's
more
right.
work to do in that whole area. But let's go back a little bit. Keith, I don't know what your thoughts might be about dealing with the economic aspects of this relationship also between China and the United States as we move forward.
I'm going to interject here a little bit about drugs. As we well know, interdiction is the great false hope of drug policy. Drugs, is so focused on demand. It is interesting that there are ebbs and flows in terms of demand for drugs. We've starting, hopefully, cross our fingers, we've seen a decline in the use of opiates and fentanyl, which is partially driven, by the deaths and the dangers of that, but also as people kind of move to different drugs. Interdiction focused on any country is not going to solve this problem. On a different topic, one of the sad consequences, I think, of this policy is to kind of drive Xi to double down on what have been very counterproductive economic policies in China. I think, as many of us know, China is in a world of hurt. There's a consensus, I think, among economists that growth in GDP, because it becomes a national target, is exaggerated by at least 2, maybe 3 percentage points per year. So we've seen an economy which is drastically slowing. People have already talked about, the declines in the population, working age. But the response from Xi since he took power has been to move back towards economic policies that have shown over and over again to be ineffective and counterproductive. And so there's been a big shift to putting more money into state-owned enterprises. There's been a big shift, China first, China only, create their own technologies, which kind of, in essence, cutting themselves off from this hugely diverse global technological innovation system that has grown up since 1945. So as a consequence, for good or ill, I think that the policies have kind of reinforced his view about how the world should work. And that's not only bad for China, that's bad for the globe in terms of having China, which is difficult to work with, that is trying to export its problems. In that process, of course, it exports its capital. One reason for the big Chinese trade surplus is that so many Chinese want to get their money out of China, put it in Canada, the United States, and elsewhere. But I think that is a kind of a sad consequence of these policies.
And what we have seen, of course, is the United States being very open to bringing the best and the brightest from around the world to come into the United States to be integrated primarily in the United States, but then they're also going into Mexico and into Canada, a lot coming into Canada to add to those production systems there. And that's just, you don't see that big flow going into China. There are many people in China who will go into these areas, but that's a bit different. So we still have that major problem of different economic models, it seems to me. And you do have, if I understand correctly, you do have China exporting more to third countries, and that material being used in third countries to produce final goods that come into the United States. And we still, I think we haven't completely figured out what we're going to do with this and what this new administration in the United States is going to do in dealing with that. I mean, they haven't figured out what they're going to do exactly with Mexico and Canada either. But there's more likelihood they're going to leave a bigger chunk of it in Mexico and Canada than they'll be happy to have it in faraway third countries. But just as the global system evolves, any thoughts on how different parts of this system should evolve, should look forward to it evolving?
Tony, can I jump in really quickly and
Please do.
comment? Yeah, I think a point that Keith made earlier is a really good one, and that is that China has been in the process, and American companies as well, and other international companies have been in the process of shifting supply chains now for several years from China, and that there's a lot of reasons for that. Tariffs are one. The tariffs from the first Trump administration certainly have had an impact on China's competitiveness. And so Chinese manufacturers and US manufacturers who are producing goods in China or buying goods from China have sought to reduce their prices or reduce their costs rather by moving some of those factories to other places, right? To Vietnam. Certainly, we've seen a big increase in trade between the United States and Vietnam, much of which is believed to be sort of just trade shifting out of China. Other places as well have been proposed as potential beneficiaries of this type of shifting. That doesn't get to necessarily to the larger issues with the U.S. economy, about trade balances and things like that. But it does change the way China interacts with the rest of the world. There are also problems inside China, as you've noted as well, Keith, and problems related to both demographics as well as decreasing returns to investment in China and in manufacturing in particular. And so the Chinese have looked for ways to boost their economic growth through subsidies, through promoting exports, and opening up markets around the world for their products. These are all real challenges that I think that the United States is going to have to face. Tariffs on China can help to solve part of the problem, perhaps, in the sense that making direct trade with China more expensive. But China is going to respond. I mean, China is also, an actor that has agency in this relationship, and so they're going to respond with additional trade measures targeting the United States and U.S. exports, perhaps, but also things that are really crucial to the U.S., the development of the U.S. economy. And we've seen already some of those things happening with respect to Chinese export controls on critical minerals. We've seen now, as I mentioned, a growing use of what I call, China's new legal toolkit, new legal economic coercion toolkit. Things like the unreliable entities list, the export control law, the anti-foreign sanctions law, using all of these tools to try to impose costs on countries, not just the United States, but countries that are engaging in activities or pursuing policies that the Chinese find detrimental to their interests. The United States has been the biggest target so far, and I think will continue to be the biggest target of Chinese use of these kinds of measures. In addition, the Chinese have been waging a campaign, a propaganda campaign, to position themselves as the defenders of the global rules-based economic order, and the WTO case that the Chinese filed in recent days in response to the Trump administration's imposition of tariffs, I think is a great example of something that the Chinese have been doing now for some time, and that is trying to paint the United States as ironically trying to paint the United States as somebody who's not inclined to uphold global rules-based economic system. Frankly, it's an incredible example of hypocrisy on the part of the Chinese to use, to try to make that pitch. However, they have the opportunity to do so because of these tariffs. And so, I think we're in a position where we are giving them a little bit of ammunition to make those cases, particularly to countries in the global South that are inclined to be receptive to that kind of propaganda when we engage in these types of tariff-related measures.
Ambassador, if I may, just
Please, Roberto.
Thank you. There's another dimension that we haven't discussed here, and in terms of how imperfect tariffs are as a policy tool for these other objectives and this enforcement, right? Like we're talking like how tariffs on China in 2018 and the beginning of the trade war between China and the US moved exports from exports from Vietnam that they were perhaps re-exports of those Chinese products, and then the capacity that the US has to enforce that, to see if compliance is actually happening. And if you add that to an environment where the Trump administration is trying to reduce bureaucracy and to weaken the bureaucratic apparatus in a time that you are then requiring for bigger checks on the compliance of these tariffs, is kind of like contradictory, right? Like if you are going to have that capacity to do so. The second point is that Jim was talking, I think is very important. And there's a lot of strain when you are a steady partner, when you are a steady market or steady government, when you send signals to the world that you are going to commit, you are going to honor your commitments, you are going to have policies that create certainty. And like we know, for example, that companies hate regulation, but something that companies hate more is uncertainty. And what you're creating with this is a level of uncertainty in terms of the US as a trading partner, as a market, as a co-productor, that then looking into alternatives and seeing those alternatives in better light, it's just natural.
No, I remember that. I remember that in US-EU relations, and I remember it in relations with Latin America and other places. There's a real value in certainty of knowing what the rules are. Even if you don't like the rules, you know what they are, you can work within them and you can question some of them, but you know what the system is. And having a situation where you don't know what the system is anymore makes it pretty hard to work with if you're a private company. Go ahead, Chris.
Can I jump in? I've been looking at some of the questions that have come in from viewers.
Oh, good. Where are they? Yes.
They're in the little Q&A box, and there are
Thank
two
you.
that there are two I want to touch on. Juan Salcedo asks, what's the conservative perspective that explains why the U.S. and the Trump administration are moving in this direction of threat rather than negotiating USMCA? And Cynthia Gorney asks us if Trump supporters are likely to see Canada and Mexico coming forward with new border controls and so on, isn't that a win for Trump's approach? And I'm going to answer both of them together. I think it's a little bit like using a sledgehammer to squash an ant. It seems like it's overkill because Canada, certainly, I think Mexico to some extent is a willing partner. But I think one of the things that the Trump style is responding to is a loss of confidence in institutions and institutional arrangements in terms of the general public, and a sense that the U.S. agenda isn't being taken seriously, and he's changing the agenda, and so he's going to make it very clear that he wants these things or else. And 25% tariff seems extreme, but the advantage it's had for Canadian leaders is the average Canadian on the street who lives in the same social media environment as most Americans and sees the tweets and all of the things that are coming out from President Trump and the executive orders and so forth, they see that and know that their leadership is going to have to make changes if it wants to avoid 25%. So it seems very blunt, but it does communicate. And in a country where sometimes these changes are difficult or they involve resources pulled away from other things, whether it's talk about border control at 2% of GDP spent on defense as part of the NATO commitment, that megaphone that Trump uses helps to marshal support, even if it's somewhat grudging, for Canadian leaders to acquiesce. And so I'm not sure about the Mexican situation, but the overkill is about getting a result. And for conservatives, yes, absolutely. I think Trump supporters see that Canada turning around, even potentially Prime Minister Trudeau's resignation, as a win for the Trump approach, and they're cheering him along. Can't be helped, I'm afraid. But it is something that I think is deliberate, not accidental, or not a mistake on Trump's part. It's what he intends.
Very good. Anybody else have any comments on any? Can everybody find the question? Does everybody have the question box? I think these are good questions and a good answer to this. And I think we're all going to have to deal with it. I mean, one of the serious things is for the three governments in the North America space to actually be talking to each other about each of these things, which they aren't really doing yet. They're still on the bigger issues, it seems to be, but they will get there. And then we do have the role of Chinese investment coming in. And we do still have the whole issue of Chinese investment going into Mexico and Canada, as well as the United States, and how we treat that as this goes forward, which we're not to a fresh point yet in doing that. Any thoughts on that from any of our speakers?
Well, Chinese investment in the United States is very, very small. I mean, it's after they bought the pork producer, there's been very little Smithfields. The way that Chinese investment come in the United States is primarily residential, and we've seen billions of dollars come in and purchase property in the United States, same as in Canada. I think in the case of as far as I know, there has been very little investment by Chinese companies in manufacturing in Canada. The key issue has always been Mexico, where we have kind of seen some of the repeat that we've seen in Vietnam, where Chinese companies have set up in Mexico. I think I don't see that as a huge issue, except in neuralgic industries. If a Chinese electric vehicle manufacturer invested in Mexico, I'm almost certainly that they would encounter 100% tariffs at the U.S. border. And some of the automotive component companies from China might face that sort of issue as well. So I think it will be a major issue between U.S. and Mexican relations about how Mexico handles investment from China.
And we do have the one U.S. manufacturer in Mexico who happens to be owned by a gentleman who has a senior position in the around the Trump administration right now. That will have to be dealt with at some point also. Who else was going to add something else?
Yes, so very quickly, yes, and it's true, like also for any investment, China's investment in Mexico, it has been growing, right, during the last years. The trade war between China and the US pushed in that direction. It has been growing like 200% during the last 2-3 years. Still is small in comparison to that investment from, like, let's say the US, but it's growing. And when you start creating that, again, an unintended consequence of the trade war between China and the US, when you start creating that economic activity between companies, suppliers, between China and Mexico, that is just creating those channels for that activity to continue growing. And there's another question on the channel here, and it's related with Andrew is asking why these three countries are not dealing with this issue together,
Yes.
right, in the institutional channels that already exist. And it's a great question, right? Because again, that trade of illegal drugs and migration, undocumented migration, it is a real issue that needs to be addressed, but it's not an issue that relies on one country doing something, right? You have migration coming to the US because there's demand for that kind of labor at a lower cost for certain activities that the US needs or relies on. There's illegal drug traffic because you have demand and you have supply of that. So when you're having these complex issues that are involving these three countries, you need to have those institutional arrangements to deal with them in an internal matter. It's not that one country has the solution for those problems.
Yeah, it would seem to me that you probably need a couple or three different dialogues and then an overarching dialogue that can bring the results of each of those together and have a discussion of them. Of course, part of that, Jim, relates back to China and our US-China policy also.
Yeah.
That there's a space for a North American dialogue on these issues, but there's a big space for a US-China dialogue on this, and then for joint action on some of the other issues. But how do you see it?
I'll just say, I think Gilberto and others are absolutely right that, solutions to the problems of, fentanyl trafficking and migration, nobody is going to solve that by themselves. I mean, the United States can't solve it by themselves. Mexico, Canada, even China can't solve these problems by themselves. Where I see the Trump administration's tariffs, though, as being perhaps valuable is in really focusing attention on these issues as the core problems that the administration wants to solve right now. We've been dealing with fentanyl issues for years now in the United States and also in other parts of North America and in Canada, or in China rather. And we obviously, migration is a primary issue for the Trump administration and for the United States at this time. We've been having discussions about migration issues literally for my entire lifetime, but we are in many ways not closer to solving the problem than we have been 10 or 20 years ago. The tariffs that the Trump administration has imposed or threatened to impose, I think are, in part, perhaps part of a trade policy strategy, but also, I believe, a way to direct the attention of policymakers in Canada, Mexico, and China on these really, really important issues that the United States is demanding solutions to immediately. And, we can certainly talk about whether or not this is the right tool. But one of the things that President Trump said before he was elected that I think has struck me as a person very much involved in looking at our economic diplomacy tools. The United States is a global economic power, and there's these tools can be used for a number of different purposes, including issues not related directly to economics. And this seems to be the view of President Trump. And it seems that he is taking this US power and applying it in areas that it has not been applied before necessarily, certainly not in the same way. And we will see whether or not this is going to be an effective strategy for addressing some of these problems. But certainly it has the attention of people in Mexico and Canada and China at this time, because we're seeing all of these responses.
Yeah, I think that's right. Chris, you want to speak about that?
Sure. I want to pick up a little bit on both Andrew's question, and there's another one here which reminds us that if Parliament comes back in Canada on March 24th, it's prorogued now, and then Canada may have an election in May, and then we have the G7 meeting. The group of 7 countries are meeting in Canada in Kananaskis in mid-June. And so the question sort of was, do those events start affecting the ability to manage these issues? And I think in one way, they really might. In the past, Mexico has occasionally been invited to join G7 meetings. There used to be a G7 +4 or +3, and then we had a G9 for a while with the Russians in and then out. I think there's a real opportunity here, given that Canada was supposed to host the last North American Leaders Summit, and it never did get scheduled. I think the most recent one was in Mexico. To actually reach out to Mexico, invite the Mexican president to participate at Kananaskis in June, and then have a little sidebar. It only has to be a short meeting, but with the North Americans having a separate meeting, leaving the rest out and saying, how can we work together? I think it's a great opportunity, would be a huge, I mean, we'd have a full agenda, but it could be a very nice way to get things moving, given how fast everything else is moving right now.
And
Great idea from our
we have done
leaders.
those kind of things in the past. We have held those more specific meetings with a larger number of countries. Yes, Gilberto.
Yes, I'm gonna pick on two very good questions from Alston. One is whether a country should retaliate or adapt facing tariffs on from a key trade partner, and the other is that challenges that an industry like the automobile industry faces on this. And those are two very good questions. The first one is, you don't do one or the other, right? Like in terms of retaliation or adapt, you move in a spectrum among them. And of course, in terms of retaliation, there are limits that Mexico has in terms of retaliation to the US, and those come from how much pain are you willing to take, right? Because the same way that these value chains are critical for the US and for Canada, they are also critical for Mexico, and that means that imposing tariffs on your trading partner, on your co-producer, you are imposing tariffs on yourself and your population. So how much pain are you willing to take is important to consider here. But then the other is the nuclear option, right? In terms of, and that goes to the second question, and that in terms of the auto industry. And this is how much we can push tariffs in North America without creating a real issue, economic issue for these three countries. And when you are thinking of North America as an integrated hub, production hub, what you have is a network of companies connected through products that they take back and forth. And when you have this so integrated network and you impose tariffs and costs that some companies cannot survive, then you start shutting down some important parts of that network. That in a network, when you do that, then the possibility of some parts of that network collapsing are real. So you're talking about whole industries, whole sectors in North America that, if this goes through, they won't exist in the same way that we are considering today. A lot of companies are going to shut down. A lot of value chains are going to stop working the way they do, and that is just going to play on the hands of other industrial hubs like Germany, in Europe, China, in Asia, in the determinant of what's happening in North America.
No, I think you're right. That the existence of various roles could disappear if you raise the cost to a certain degree. Any other thoughts on this?
Yeah, just to again respond to the question, what do you do when a country imposes tariffs on you? What Estonia it totally eliminated all tariffs, recognizing that tariffs are really a tax on exports, and embarked on a decade or so of extraordinary economic growth. One of the policy recommendations, people have said, okay, drop your tariffs on everybody else, and then just instead of raising tariffs against the countries imposing tariffs on you, and what you do is you're diverting trade. It also results in economic efficiency. One other kind of side comment here, there has not been a discussion yet about fiscal policy. And we will always have a large trade deficit if our fiscal balance is so out of whack. And right now, we are really entering a period in the United States of what is called crowding out. That is, the government is sucking in so much capital that there is not enough capital, or capital becomes very expensive for housing and for investment. And right now in the United States, we're looking at 4.5% of what economists call real interest rates. That is what you're paying over and above the rate of inflation. And, if it goes up another 2 percentage points, if there's no attention paid to how much money the government's borrowing, we will end up with recession in this country, as precipitated both by housing and by investment. So to think that tariffs somehow will solve the big fiscal problem is just not true. And so I think some of the focus on tariffs really is distracting from a very major problem in the United States in terms of fiscal policy.
Keith, that's an excellent point. I'm sure a number of our political leaders are not wanting to focus on that because it's a hard thing to focus on, but it's a very valid point. Any other thoughts from any of you? Jim, did you want to add anything from a China perspective?
Yeah, maybe one last thing that I'll say is that, China can, and I expect will try their best to use these tariffs as a way to sort of spin the narrative in the global South and in other communities as well. Chris mentioned in Canada. I've heard other European leaders suggest that they may be more open to the possibility of engaging with China than they were a month or two ago, following the threat of Trump tariffs. I expect that China is going to try and take advantage of the moves of the administration in the past couple of weeks to portray themselves as responsible stewards of the global economy, and look for ways to drive wedges between the United States and Canada, the United States and Mexico, the United States and our European allies and trading partners, and others around the world. And and say things like I think maybe Gilberto or others mentioned, that the U.S. is maybe not a trustworthy partner, or maybe not a predictable trading partner, and so China much more is. I think that is I would do that if I were the Chinese. I expect that they will be engaged in diplomatic activities to try to bolster their status globally. I think that we have to be in the United States aware of these challenges, and also be willing to go out and respond to them and try to explain to people what it is we're trying to do with our economic policy. We are in a transition period. The new administration is coming in and making a lot of changes, very quickly. We'll see if things settle down, and if that ability to communicate what we're doing and what our intentions are is something that will resonate around the world. But we have to be aware that China is looking for opportunities to step in where the United States may be perceived as stepping back. And it's certainly in our interest as the United States to find ways to counter that. I also want to mention, that I think you mentioned earlier, Tony, China is also facing its own challenges economically. They have a number of issues with respect to local debt, and I think I mentioned demographics earlier, and other things, and the structure of their economy is also undergoing some really challenging changes at the moment. And so they're not all powerful by any stretch, right? They're not going to be able to throw money at every country that is asking for money. They're not going to be able to commit resources to try to backfill the United States in every place. But but they will try, I'm sure, where they think it's strategically to their advantage, and where they have opportunities. And we need to be aware of that, and be, as the U.S. government, we need to be prepared to think about how we counter that.
I think that's right. And then Chris, I'll go to you. And I just want to say that one of the challenges in all of this is balancing all the different relationships off with each other, and drawing the best lessons from each one to get us to a final place. And so while we might be concerned about the U.S. Canada and the U.S. Mexico, and you about the U.S. China, we're all trying to balance, get the most out of all of that. And that's a complex set of issues. And then when we add in Europe into this, and others that makes it more complex. And so you're exactly right that this is going to take a lot of complex thinking. Chris.
I want to pick up on your comment, Tony, and also what Jim was saying. I think underlying all of this is a discussion about the relationship between the global South and the North. After World War II, the U.S., which had grown pretty successfully after the Revolutionary War, et cetera, through a kind of early version of import substitution, industrialization, and expansion in the West, the so-called American system, the U.S. turned against that, and it offered the world instead a model of export-led growth. And that was what, Uruguay Round, WTO, these trade agreements were all supposed to promise to developing countries that rather than import substitution, they could open themselves up, but also grow by exporting to the United States. Now, if you look at some of what's said around the Trump administration, they seem to want to change that agreement, arguing that China's broken it, that they're flooding the world with exported goods that they produce cheaply and sell below market, almost like the old Standard Oil case where the Rockefellers, had cheap gasoline on every corner to put all the other gas stations out of business. We've seen this behavior before. So they've said, okay, now we're going to go back to an import substitution reindustrialization. We use tariffs to rebuild manufacturing in the US and so forth. I think if that is where the Trump administration sees itself going, and can't speak for them, it raises a profound question about what is the U.S. offer to the rest of the world. And China's not offering export-led growth either, because it's very hard to sell into China. But how do we recalibrate global growth in a way that offers friendly countries that have, of course, want to grow, an opportunity to do so in a U.S. or a Chinese-led order? And I think that part of the conversation has been largely left out, but we need to bring it to the fore because it's an important question.
Yeah, Chris, you're exactly right. The whole series of debates we used to have about the broad negotiation, the partial regional negotiations, the cross-regional negotiations, we're not having those discussions anymore. We're sort of stuck in another world of where we are working, and some of it is US, Mexico, Canada, some of it is US, Europe, some of it is different bilateral agreements, but there's not a forward direction yet for this. We have to work on getting there, it seems to me, and figuring out how we take this forward in a productive way for everybody. And it seems we have a lot of work to do that. But Chris, let me turn it back to you. It seems to me that we're about at time to tie everything together.
Well, I have very good manners. I'm going to turn it back to Leila because I see that she's come back, and she's my colleague with the most, so I'm going to defer to her.
Okay, Leila, please.
Thank you, Ambassador. Well, first of all, I want to thank all of our panelists for joining us today. It's been an incredibly insightful conversation. Thank you, Gilberto, of course. Chris, thank you so much for being the Canadian voice. Jim, Keith, thank you so much for participating. And Ambassador Wayne, as always, for doing an incredible job moderating this conversation. I think there's a lot of issues that are still up in the air ahead of the really impactful month ahead. And so at the Wilson Center, both the Canada, Mexico, Kissinger, and WABA Institutes will be doing a lot of programming and publications and monitoring the situation very closely. But I think if there's a key takeaway from all the conversations and all the insights that we've had today is that North America integration as a whole, and even with the USMCA, can really increase North America's competitiveness. It can actually compete vis-a-vis other trading blocs. And so hopefully all three countries and all three partners are able to sort of, make amends and strike agreements, hopefully before that 30-day mark. And of course, we can't forget China's role in all of this and the future of North America. So thank you, all of you, for being with us today. And thank you to all of our virtual participants. We probably will be having another webinar at the end of the month, depending on the results. So keep an eye out for that. And again, thank you so much. Have a wonderful afternoon, everyone.
Thank you all.